Hi Year 7 and welcome to the last lesson of this week, Fertilization and Germination. So to start with this lesson, we're going to do some revision from the previous lesson, but also ask some kind of questions which you need to work out yourselves. So on the side there are 8 questions that I would like you to try and answer. And then there's 2 challenge questions. What is nectar? And what do bees use it to make? So pause the video now and have a go at trying to answer the 8 questions on the side there. And if you're feeling brave, have a go at answering the 2 challenge questions. Okay, hopefully you've answered them. Let's go through the answers now. So, what are the 2 main ways plants are pollinated? They are pollinated by insects and wind. What 2 structures form the stamen, the male sex organ part of the flower? The anther and the filaments. What 3 structures form the carpel? That's the stigmas, the styles, and the ovaries. What is the name of the male gamete? That is the pollen. Okay, it's the male reproductive cell or sex cell. And where is the female gamete, the ovule, found? It is found in the ovary. What part of the flower is the pollen transferred to? That is the stigma. Name 3 ways flowers attract pollinators. They attract pollinators with nectar, scent, and color. Why is pollen sticky or spiky? It's sticky or spiky to be caught by the stigma. And the challenge question, what is nectar? It's a sugary fluid secreted by flowers to attract insects, because they need to get the insects in order for their pollen to stick to the insects to then be transferred to another flower. And lastly, what do bees use it to make? They use that nectar to make honey. Okay, let's jump into the lesson on fertilization and germination. So, last lesson we looked at all of these different parts. This is just here as a reminder, so you can flip back to it if you're at all confused. So, can you have a go at trying to answer these questions for me? So these are thinking questions, shall we say. So have a think. Why do you think wind-pollinated flowers contain nectar? Why do you think wind-pollinated flowers smell? Why are wind-pollinated flowers usually green or brown? Do wind-pollinated plants have more or less pollen than insect-pollinated plants? Are there any parts of the flower that hang outside? And do you think pollen is heavy or light? Do I think... Firstly, wind-pollinated flowers don't contain nectar because they don't need to attract attention from insects and animals. They don't have a smell because, again, they don't need to attract attention from insects and animals. And they're usually green or brown because they want to avoid attention from insects and animals. So they don't need to attract insects or animals because they're getting their pollen from plant to plant via the wind. So they have no need for the insects in order to land on them and pass that pollen along. So therefore, they use the wind and have no need for insects to land on them. So they don't have pollen, they don't have nectar, they don't smell, and they're usually a plain color. Wind-pollinated plants also have more pollen than insect-pollinated plants because there's a far lower chance of successful fertilization because they're throwing their pollen into the air and just hoping that it lands on another flower, while as insect-pollinated plants know that their pollen is going to go to another flower because those insects always go from flower to flower to flower. Okay, so there's a much higher chance of success for insect-pollinated flowers. Are there any parts of the flower that hang outside? Yes, the stamen and stigmas hang outside the flower in order to increase their chances of successfully catching pollen and releasing pollen. Do you think pollen is heavy or light? It's extremely light because it needs to be carried further by the wind, but also by tiny little insects. So pollen's really, really light. So this is basically how flower fertilization happens. If you want to see a really interesting video on it, open the PowerPoint slide on the Show My Homework link and watch that video. But basically what happens is a pollen grain lands on the surface of a stigma and it produces this tube, this pollen tube. So the inside of the tip of the tube contains the male cells of the flower. Just like a sperm cell's got a big long tail and the head of it contains the male sex cells. In a flower it's slightly different and you've got the pollen tubes which contain the male cells, male gamete cells. So these tubes grow down the style to reach the ovules in the ovary. So they actually grow through the style in order to reach the ovules in the ovary. And then obviously inside each of the ovule, you've got the female reproductive cell, which is the egg cell. So the pollen grains, they land on the top of the stigma, they grow downwards through the style and then into the ovary and the ovule to the egg cell, where they then release their male sex cells, and the gametes would then fuse with the female sex cell, the egg cell. There you go there. That's just what it contains. Yeah. So, seeds now. We're going to look at them a bit further next week's lessons, but we're going to start having a look at seeds because they're quite incredible. We'll go in a little bit more detail of them, but these are basically the main three sections of a seed. You've got the coat, the seed coat, which is the protective covering of the seed. So it keeps the inside seed safe, the food store safe. The food supply or store basically contains all the energy and nutrients needed for the embryo to grow. And then you've got the embryo, which will become the new plant. So before a plant has leaves and starts to photosynthesize and create its own energy and nutrients, it needs energy in order to grow enough so that it can create leaves and grow. And that's where the seed comes in, the food supply comes in. So what three things does a seed need to germinate? Water, oxygen, and heat. So when it has those three things, it then starts to germinate, starts to grow root, but also grow upwards and grow leaves in order to be able to start photosynthesizing. And it uses those food supplies in the seed in order to power or feed that growth. So light is therefore only needed when it is germinated and actually successfully reached through the top of the soil. And it doesn't need nutrients, obviously, because it's got everything it needs to start growing within the seed. So water soaks into the seed coat. The seed coat splits. The root will start to grow downwards, and then the small embryo will grow up. Okay, and then those cotyledones will turn green with sunlight. They'll then start to photosynthesize, and with that energy, they'll then produce more leaves, which then means they'll be able to photosynthesize more, which means they'll then be able to add more energy, and so on and so forth, until it grows into a full plant. So, what I want you to do as a fun task to end the lesson is create a cartoon strip showing how a plant is pollinated, fertilizes, and then germinates to become a flower. So can you do it in 6 cartoon block strips? I've got a tiny little one here, but it's obviously not complete, is it? It's only showing a very basic understanding of pollination, fertilization, and germination. Can you tell me or draw for me a cartoon strip showing all the steps in more detail for me? I'm going to say the best 2 from each class will win a house point. As always, Year 7, take care and stay safe.